Hi everybody. I'm going to kind of cover in this video some of the things we didn't get to talk about in class today. The first one I want to discuss is the iceberg theory. So this is a theory in literature, sometimes known as the theory of omission, and it's a style of writing first sort of used by the American author Ernest Hemingway. This style has kind of turned into a literary term. So what is the iceberg theory? Basically, the iceberg theory is a way of writing a story where the important parts of the story, the bigger story itself, is hidden below, sort of hidden out of sight, just like an iceberg is mostly hidden under the surface of the ocean. The way Hemingway developed this writing is basically through his journalism. So when he was starting out as a young journalist, he focused his newspaper reporting on simply the events that happened in the real world, the immediate events, and he didn't give them any context. He didn't try to delve into the real story behind something, right? The real story of why someone, got divorced or someone got murdered or why a war happened. He didn't delve into that. He left that stuff out as a way to highlight it. And he later did this in his own writing, where many of his stories, you have characters having an interaction, and their dialogue and their sort of thoughts directly avoid the real story. And by doing this, they kind of put a spotlight on it. So it's almost a way of writing that's like reverse psychology, where you leave out a focus on the most important parts. So the reason I'm talking about this is you may start to recognize this in stories that you read for COG. And instead of immediately saying, I'm confused, what is this story actually about? If you read it carefully, you might say, this is a really fascinating and effective way to talk about something without actually talking about it. So for those of you that are in English 229, you're going to use this for this story due next week. The story Visiting Hours by Judith Budnitz is a perfect example of the iceberg model that we're talking about. Once you've read the story, think about how this story operates with this iceberg model. So what's happening in the story? What enormous thing is actually hidden under the surface that's not being talked about? Is the narrator in the story reliable or unreliable? How do we know this? And then the last question is, why does the nurse in the story find the brother in a worse condition than he ought to be at this point in the healing process? So answer those questions and think about the story in the context of the iceberg model. Okay, so breaking down a 5-paragraph essay. For those of you in Hume 329, you're going to need to write your next analysis on one of these stories in a 5-paragraph literary analysis essay format. For all of you, you're going to want to learn how to do this. It's kind of the basis of the class, and it's the basis of all sort of literary analysis. So the guide I'm using is How to Write a Literary Analysis Essay, which is in the Welcoming module. So you can open that up or you can kind of follow along in here. Here are the key parts of writing a 5-paragraph essay. 1. Analysis is breaking the story down into specific parts. Each story is encoded with more information than you might immediately recognize. Only by breaking it down can you understand it thoroughly. So as the guide says, with any analysis, this requires you to break the subject down into its component parts. Examine the different elements of a piece of literature to help you better appreciate and understand the work. Okay? This is similar to what we did in class today. Analyzing a short story might include a particular theme, right? How does the story suggest that theme? We did that in class today. So one way to analyze is using some literary terms and applying them to the story. Other thing to remember is that writing an analysis is, it's very important to be focused and very organized. So writing a literary analysis essay isn't the same as just sort of talking about it in class. It's very organized, and it sticks to a specific point of development. You are making a central argument or interpretation about the story, and everything in that argument organizes the rest of the essay. So you're making an argument towards an interpretation. You can always start with, is the story good or bad? Did I not like the story? Did I like the story? And then go into more details. Well, why? What do they do in the story that's impressive? Okay, this interpretation or argument is your thesis statement. For a 5-paragraph essay, you're probably going to write a what is called a 3-part thesis statement, where you're making 3 different sort of arguments about the one story, giving 3 sort of reasons why it's a good piece, right? You might analyze sort of theme, tone, and its use of dramatic irony, perhaps. Or maybe you analyze dialogue and setting and, characterization, or its use of symbol, or whatever. So that's your thesis statement. Starting an essay, you start with an introduction. And in your introduction, you want to grab the reader's attention. You can do this by using a quotation, or a provocative question, or a brief anecdote, startling statement, or a combination. You don't have to, when you're just doing a draft, think about a hook, but when you get to a final draft, you want to add in some kind of hook to catch the reader's attention. What comes after that? Well, you also want to tell us who's the author of the piece, what's the title of the piece, when was it published, where was it published, and then you want to give us some context. Tell us the basic plot of the story. Who are the main characters? What's happening to them? What's the outcome of the story? You can also talk about the sort of larger context of the piece. Is it notable? Is it a well-known story? Is it famous? What have other critics said about it? Last, you can define any terms you need. So if you're analyzing it using literary terms, what are those terms and what do they mean? You might want to tell the reader what dramatic irony is, or what theme is. So if you have terms to describe, you want to do that. And you can look at examples here. There's examples of introductions. Okay? The introduction is going to end with an analysis, a thesis statement. So here's an example. This is the thesis statement, and they're talking about Robert Browning's poem, My Last Duchess. The thesis is, character analysis of the Duke reveals that through his internal dialogue, his interpretation of earlier incidents, and his actions, his traits, arrogance, jealousy, and greediness emerge. That's it. Or here's one analyzing Alberto Alvaro Rios' short story, The Secret Lion, and the thesis is, the key symbols in the story reinforce its main theme. Change is inevitable and always accompanied by a sense of loss. A good thesis is an interpretation, and it's debatable. You could argue a good thesis one way or the other. For example, in class today, people have said maybe Sid isn't actually in love with Charlene. That's a good thesis. If you argue that Sid is in love with Charlene or that he is not, and gave reasons why, that's a great thesis because it's open to interpretation, right? If you want to debate about, does Charlene actually have an abortion? Does she not? Does it matter? That's also a debatable thesis. But you don't want to use like a statement of fact or summarize the story. That's not interpretation. Okay, so once you have a 3-part thesis, you're going to explain those arguments in 3 separate paragraphs. So these are your body paragraphs that come after your introduction. Each of these body paragraphs should start with what is called a topic sentence. So a topic sentence develops the central idea of what you're arguing. It states one of the topics associated with your thesis, combined with an assertion about how the topic will support the central idea. So it tells your reader what the paragraph is going to be about, and it makes an argument. Once you've made a topic sentence, you follow it up with evidence. You say, this is my interpretation. Here are pieces of evidence, quotations, to back it up. Once you've given a quotation, you kind of explain that quotation, expand upon it, and then repeat the cycle. In the last part of your 5-paragraph essay, the last paragraph is a conclusion. In a conclusion, you've got a few options. Often a conclusion restates your thesis, as well as the major arguments you've made in support of it. The conclusion can also summarize key points. It can also address sort of larger issues surrounding the story and kind of where we are as why this story is important to us as a society right now. Okay, so for help working on this, look over this essay. I would suggest you read through this analysis, especially the first 3 pages. Reach out to me if you have any questions. We'll also review this next week. That's a basic breakdown of 5-paragraph essay, and good luck working on it. I'll see you all online this week in the discussions, and I will see you all in class next Tuesday.